Good evening and welcome to The Path Forward, U.S. Environmental Leadership Beyond 2020. I'm Stan Myberg, and it's my privilege to direct the Graduate Studies in Sustainability here at Wake Forest University. And on behalf of the Sustainability Graduate Program, the Wake Forest Leadership and Character Program, and the Wake Forest Center for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability, we are delighted that you could join us. I know that there are some folks who are still connecting in, but we're really glad to have you all with us tonight. And we're here tonight at a remarkable moment in American environmental history. In the 50 years since EPA opened its doors in December 1970, the United States has made great progress in improving the quality of the nation's air, water, and land. This occurred as a result of presidential and congressional leadership by both Republicans and Democrats. But at the same time, we face extraordinary challenges. And the question is, what kind of public leadership will suffice for this moment? And we could not have two more distinguished leaders to help us sort through all of this. Gina McCarthy was EPA's 13th administrator, serving from 2013 to 2017 in the second term of the Obama administration. During her tenure, EPA established a clean power plan to reduce carbon emissions from electric power plants by 32% by 2030, set strict carbon emission standards for cars, created limits on methane emissions from oil and gas operations, issued the first health advisory for the forever chemicals, and promoted environmental justice and public health throughout EPA. Before becoming administrator, Gina headed EPA's air pollution control activities and was the environmental commissioner for the state of Connecticut. She is a proud native of the Boston area and is currently president of the Natural Resources Defense Council. Lee Thomas was EPA's 6th administrator, serving from 1985 to 1989 in the second term of the Reagan administration. During his tenure, EPA secured congressional reauthorization of Superfund, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and the Clean Water Act. Lee also led U.S. efforts to establish and ratify the 1987 Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, an international agreement that has significantly reduced damage to the ozone layer in the stratosphere that protects Earth from ultraviolet radiation. Before becoming administrator, Lee was the head of EPA's Superfund and waste management activities and was a senior official with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And following his service as administrator, Lee had a highly successful and distinguished career as a business leader. So Gina and Lee, welcome to Wake Forest, even if it is a virtual welcome, and we're so glad to have you. What we'd like to do tonight is to make this as conversational as possible, given the constraints of the online format. And so I'll be asking questions of both of the former administrators until around 8:30 or so. And in the meantime, I hope those of you watching will be thinking of questions you'd like to ask, and you can submit them through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And we'll collect the questions, and I'll pose as many as I can to the two administrators during the remainder of our time. So Gina, let me first start with you. There's many questions you could ask about leadership and the path forward in American environmental policy, but it's worth a moment to think back on some history. You both came into the position of administrator in the second term of a presidential administration, following some widely respected predecessors. So Gina, how did you choose to focus your attention in the face of the many different issues that you had in front of you?
Well, Stan, I think in the position I'm at, I recognize that I was following a really terrific person, Lisa Jackson, who was really quite pivotal in making some, what I would think of as transformational changes at EPA. You know, she not only worked on really challenging environmental issues, but she worked on the issues of environmental justice. And so that was a constant refrain and correct one to challenge us to look at all the health impacts, especially to the most vulnerable communities, and how we could do better at listening to those voices and understanding and resolving some of those issues. So for me, it was a natural that I would continue her legacy and move forward. But in addition to that, you know EPA better than probably both Lee and I. You basically live there for so long, and you know that sometimes you can control what you focus on, sometimes you can't. And so a lot of what you had to focus on for me was legacy of what was left behind. In other words, rules that were done and not done correctly in the prior administration, as well as work that we needed to keep up with because every statute requires you to keep doing work. So we were facing significant challenges that we had to address legally. But the best part was that you could really also focus on one or two key issues that both you and the president agreed were the most important things to do. And that's where you wanted to always focus your personal attention. And for me, the issue was climate change. And I didn't have to really do a lot of lifting for that. It was it was the single issue that President Obama wanted to address in his second term. And it was the issue that for me was as yet unresolved in any substantive way at EPA. So I was really excited to take that up.
Lee, how about you? Oh, Lee, I think you're still on mute.
Got it. I was really fortunate in that I had worked with Bill Ruckelshaus for 18 months before he resigned at the end of the first term. Now, remember, Bill had come back into the agency after a lot of controversy to really restore the integrity of EPA, get the agency back on track, doing the things that it needed to do. And I had been his assistant administrator working on the waste program, Superfund and RCRA. So I was fortunate in having worked with Bill. One, he was just a fantastic leader, seeing the kind of things he did to get the agency moving. So one, I needed to continue a lot of things he was doing, rebuilding the agency. And that had to do with strengthening the overall approach we were taking as far as personnel is concerned. So I worked on things like the SES program and how do we strengthen that part of the program? How do we put a stronger management training program in place? So the things related to strengthening the agency. I also wanted to continue some of the major rulemakings that we needed to conclude. Phasing lead out of gasoline would be a great example. Implementing things that we were doing under RCRA, like moving forward with a big new underground storage tank program. How are we going to deal with leaking underground storage tanks? And then the final thing I wanted to work on was I had an opportunity to do a lot of work with Congress now that the agency was back on track, had a reestablished credibility. And so we were able to work on reauthorization of Superfund. It took several years, but we made major improvements in that program. Reauthorization of the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, implementing RCRA, which we got reauthorized, and a number of issues like that where we were able to work with Congress. We had more of a bipartisan approach now in working with Congress, and we got a lot of things done.
Let me flip the question just a little bit. Now, again, you had really distinguished predecessors, but you had to establish your own style as a leader. Were there things you felt you needed to do to change from the practices of your immediate predecessors? And Lee, I guess back to you on that first.
All right, I'll go back. I don't think I wanted to change anything that Bill was doing. I wanted to build on the things that he had done. And particularly, I believe when you're in an agency, I was basically a government manager. I mean, I viewed this as an opportunity to strengthen that agency. He had started it. I saw a lot of things I could do to continue to build that. One of the things I did was to try to improve communication with the state environmental agencies and work very actively to set up an ongoing communication process on a quarterly basis with representatives of the state agencies, because it's all about federal standards, but state execution. So how are we going to collaborate and communicate? Those are the kind of things I worked on. On the other hand, substantively, I had spent a year and a half working with Bill managing the waste programs. There were a lot of things on the waste programs that needed to be done. Superfund, I talked about reauthorization, but implementing a lot of the things under Superfund. We established the first national priorities list. We exercised the whole emergency response program, getting the RCRA program that we'd reauthorized up and all the new elements of that running. I mean, we put a whole new approach in place for regulation as it related to treatment of waste, management of waste, liners for landfills, all those kind of things. And then I was learning all about a whole new set of issues, the issues under the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. So somebody told me one time, or an agency like that, is don't just work out of your inbox, Lee. Identify what are the major issues you think you can get done. Your inbox is always full, and you've got to work on a lot of those issues, but some of the big issues really come along. I mentioned some of them already, but that's how I got into the stratospheric ozone issue. That issue came along. It was clear from a scientific point of view that we really needed to move forward to deal with that issue. That's an example of a big issue that you make a decision, you've got to tackle this issue. There were other issues like that. But that's the kind of approach I tried to take.
Gina, how about you?
Well, Stan, you know this as well as anybody, is the second term is different than the first, okay, for a president, and I was second term and Lisa was first. The one advantage that I had during that, when I came in, was that I had been working in the agency and I was really familiar with the team in the White House. Because when you're at EPA, you're always running into trouble, right? Because you're always doing things that a lot of people don't want you to do. It's just a controversial place to be, even though you work hard at it. And so I had a familiarity with this team. So I knew that my big advantage was that I wasn't starting from scratch in those relationships as Lisa did. And I knew from firsthand that a relationship with the people in the White House was key. You had to have the White House trust you every step of the way. And because I had a history with them where I told them it was okay to do these car rules, we're going to work it out. The companies are going to join. It's going to be a great celebration. And when it did, they were like, oh, okay, let's do the next thing, And so we ended up with, I enjoyed the history that I had crafted, and it gave me an ability to have, I think, out of the gate, a good, strong relationship with the White House and obviously the president's chief of staff, which is always so key to being able to move things quickly. And I also had the disadvantage that I right after I started, we had the shutdown. And so I had to help guide the agency through that. And as you know, those are always miserable. And that sort of builds collaboration with the staff, because I made lots of calls to them every day, trying to ask them what they would do and tell them it would be okay. So there are things that you work hard intentionally, and there are other things that land on you that are difficult that you can turn to your advantage.
Yes, and those calls were important. Lee, you'll appreciate this. I can remember our staff said, I got a call from Gina McCarthy, and they couldn't believe it. So that was pretty fun. But it speaks to my next question, actually, which is one of the challenges of being a leader, and is that people sort of impart to you so many of their own hopes and values and ideals and aspirations. And what's that like? What's it like to be the object of all that that sort of values being imparted to you? And how do you deal with that responsibility? And Gina, I'm going to go to you first this time.
Lee said this in our earlier discussion. It's really about people skills. It's about communication. You have passionate people on all sides of an issue that want you to agree with them. And I think you have to really form relationships with your staff. You have to form relationships with constituency groups so that they understand that you're being honest with them. You're explaining your assessment of the situation. You're letting them know what you think your limitations are. And you have to be a good listener. People just want to know that you care about them, that you're willing to go out and walk the floors and chat with people, which I did all the time, so that you're not some aloof leader, but you're really just the person who's doing the best they can to work with the staff to understand their needs, to understand the job we have to do together, and to make sure you're part of that family, that people feel like they're being listened to the same way as you want to be listened to by your family. And maybe I even more often listened to you than your family did, which is always a good advantage.
Lee?
I think first is you have to realize that is what being a leader is all about. And that is setting that example that in fact the staff, as Gina says, understands that you understand them, that in fact you want their input. People used to laugh about the fact that we had big meetings. Big meetings were as important because you wanted people not only to provide input, you wanted them to understand how in fact you took that input and made decisions. What was the rationale for the decision? They may not totally agree with you, but they would understand, one, they had the input, and two, what was the rationale for the decision that was made, and that they were a part of an overall team and you understood that. I think the second thing is a set of values, that you treat people with dignity and respect. You realize that everybody in an organization plays a role. I don't care whether it's a clerical person or whether it's a senior manager. Everybody has an important role to play. And you treat people that way, and you expect the entire team to act that way. So you walk the talk. You not only understand and have values, you in fact exhibit those values. I think that's really important. I've had an opportunity to leave a number of organizations as I've moved from job to job. One of the things that's really impressed me is the feedback I've gotten from people way down in some of the organizations I've run, whether it's companies or whether it's government agencies, who have told me the impact that I had. And frankly, a lot of it was positive. People that I would have no idea that I was having an impact on them, but I did. Very rewarding. And it just emphasizes to you how important it is that you recognize that that's the role you play.
Well, a related question, Lee, back to you on that point is, given those characteristics that you saw in your own leadership style, what characteristics did you look for in selecting people who worked with you as part of your senior leadership team?
Well, clearly some of those same characteristics, but I wanted people who, one, were smart, who, two, were committed to be a part of a team, because that's what you're building, is a team. And you want people who can challenge you, but at the same time can rally around the kind of decision and direction that you feel is needed. You want people who can communicate well. And you want people, in my case, who are committed to the agency, committed to the mission of the agency, or committed to the company or the mission of the company. You want people who are passionate.
Gina?
Sometimes I feel when I'm doing this with Lee that I should say, yeah, what he just said.
That's okay.
Because it was perfect. I think the only other sort of complexity to the jobs that we had that people outside government may not recognize is that when you're in EPA, when I was there were 15,000 plus. I don't think there's quite as many now, but 15,000 plus people that dedicated their entire life to that agency and its mission. And the staff were incredible, like you, Stan, and all of the really the senior staff. They had been doing this work for a long time. And so we just march in with, certainly I've been doing environmental work all my life, but not at EPA, and not always on EPA with EPA employees. And you're a political employee. So the first thing you need to recognize is you're a horse of a different color. I'm no longer the staff person. And so the most important thing that you had to do in recognizing the people that worked with you was that they had tremendous value. And your job was to give them the freedom to tell you what you should do and to question you and to make sure that in coming back, you valued their input. And also when the questioning was done and decisions were made, you wanted to know that they would fully embrace that decision and move forward. And while we may not have agreed on every point, to end up with them knowing that you did the very best you could in making that decision. And you did listen and take their concerns and the mission of EPA as the primary thing. So it was awesome to work, Stan, with you and all of your colleagues, because they brought out the best in me. And my job was just to make sure that I brought out the best in you.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about now some environmental policy challenges. And we're going to talk about climate change a little later. But first, when we're talking about here about a path forward for U.S. environmental policy, what do you see as the most immediate challenge, environmental challenge facing the country other than climate change? And Gina, I'm going to go to you first on that.
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges we're facing is actually a water quality challenge. If I had to guess one, that's what I'd go with. I mean, you mentioned forever chemicals. You know, we are seeing now pretty extensive contamination, and that's obviously in some ways related to climate change, because that can create these harmful algal blooms, and it can also create flooding, which is a challenge. And I don't see the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act as the most powerful tools that we have in our toolbox. And so I think that's an area where both there's a lot of work that needs to be done to identify the waters that need to be protected, which is an issue that has been challenging the agency for decades, to get a system of dealing with that that's better than the Army Corps doing the permit, and we sit around and think about whether it was good or not. It just isn't. It's a challenge, and people are seeing it and feeling it and losing confidence because of forever chemicals, that they know what's going on in their drinking water. And the last thing that you want to do is to have a population that begins to question whether or not the agency is doing its job and they can trust the water that they're drinking, especially at a time of a pandemic. And so the water shortages and water quality and infrastructure needs in water and wastewater are to me pretty big issues.
Lee, what do you think?
You know, it's interesting. I would probably pick the water issue as well. And I think that it's a broad range of issues. We're still struggling in this country with non-point source runoff. I mean, I live on the St. Johns River in Jacksonville, and it's a significant issue on the St. Johns. And we've struggled with non-point source and how do you deal with non-point source since I was at EPA. Gina mentioned drinking water issues. I mean, we worked on reauthorizing the Safe Drinking Water Act over 30 years ago. I mean, there's just major issues still as far as drinking water is concerned. Estuaries. We had estuary programs, whether it's the Chesapeake Bay, Puget Sound. I mean, we've made progress on those, but we've still got a ways to go. And today we know we've got significant issues as far as the oceans are concerned. Good gosh, one of the real issues under climate change that I don't think gets as much attention is ocean acidification, and we've got significant issues there. We've got plastic issues as far as the ocean is concerned. So if I think about the breadth of issues that water quality hits and the impact it's having on our environment, I'd say that's one we've got to continue to tackle, put a lot of focus on, because we've still got a long way to go.
And I mean, add that to all of the infrastructure deterioration. The United States and Congress loves to build things. They just don't like to fix them, and they never like to give them money to keep up. Do you know what I mean? It just doesn't have the same kind of zip for a politician. And we see, I mean, think about the challenges we're having along the Missouri and the Mississippi with the levees that just won't continue to operate because we're just seeing the intense storms that we're seeing as a result of climate. So these challenges are very expensive and they're very localized, and it makes all of the problems, I think, pale in significance in some ways.
Well, let me follow up with both of you then on a related question, which is that, as you know, if water is one of our biggest challenges, there's been this continuing controversy about the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act and what water should be federally regulated versus what waters should be regulated and the responsibility of state and local governments. What do you think about that?
Well, if you're asking me, Stan,
Yeah, sure.
clearly it's been an issue for a long time. It is an issue because it is not clear under the federal statutes, what are waters of the United States versus what aren't. So clarifying that is either an issue Congress has got to deal with, or an issue that at some point I would say the Supreme Court is going to have to deal with. The way in which I think that it's got to be dealt with in a practical way is a collaboration at a federal and state level. I think it's going to take a strong federal approach and strong oversight of state execution, just as we've done with many other environmental statutes. Now, when I was at EPA, we took on the issue of wetlands, kind of the tail end of the process, or the headwaters of the process, if you want to think about it that way. And we actually worked hard and came up with an overall approach of no net loss for wetlands. The concept of, look, we all agree we've got a significant issue here. Now we've got to go to work on how do we preserve and how do we mitigate the impacts as far as wetlands are concerned. That was one approach, but that was, and in fact, Bill Riley took that on when he became administrator and really ran with it with Congress. And I think it still is, I think it's had a real impact. But the jurisdictional issue and what in fact is federal responsibility, what in fact is individual property rights versus community rights is a extremely controversial issue that is ultimately going to be dealt with, in my opinion, either by Congress or by the court.
Gina, anything to add?
Just raise one more issue, and that is that I think one of the challenges we face with most of the water rules is they give states primacy on these issues, which in and of itself is fine. But the federal government in many of the water related issues has a secondary watchdog type role. And often what we're seeing now over the past, 10 years, maybe more, is a real disinvestment in environmental work at the state level. So we are seeing a very weakened state system, environmental system. As money got tight, and it puts the EPA in a very awkward position because the states are allocated resources to do a job, and if they use those resources and it doesn't get dedicated to doing that job, but instead we have weakened staff and weakened money access and resources, then we're in trouble. And EPA cannot continue to sort of take over state programs. So there needs to be a real reckoning, especially in the water area, that these issues warrant both state and federal investments and resources working together, or we're not going to be where we need to be.
I have a somewhat related, but maybe a little bit different angle on this question about what do you think is the most underrated role of EPA in protecting public health? And Gina, that's sort of aimed at you first.
Well, one of the things that I learned about EPA that I didn't know before I got here, and this is probably not true of Lee, is that there's a couple of things that I realized when we were in the shutdown and you couldn't do them anymore. One was that we play a very large role looking at toxicity in products and substances, and we do it with products that come in from other countries. And we have to go and certify some types of products coming in to ensure they meet standards. Nobody knows that. I didn't know that. And that was the one thing that was really causing anxiety, is that if we weren't around to do that kind of a job, if we weren't worried about lead in t-shirts and motorcycles that didn't have the right air equipment on it, if we weren't worried about those things, people recognized that it was an immediate health threat. And so it was one of those jobs that you couldn't not do. You had to keep doing it and find the resources to be able to make that happen, even during a shutdown. And I think, so there's lots of little things that the organization, the agency does that people simply don't know about. But food safety may actually be another, and that's related to pesticides and other products that EPA is responsible to make sure are handled properly and used appropriately. And that is a vital, core, frontline issue.
Lee?
I would just build on that, saying I think that probably the authorities that EPA has under the Toxic Substances Control Act and FIFRA, the Fungicide and Insecticide Act, those authorities and the work that EPA does are incredibly important for any variety of reasons. And I think they're probably far less understood by the public as a role that EPA plays, as opposed to clean air, clean water, those kind of things. But in fact, they have a tremendous impact from an environmental point of view, a public health point of view, and frankly, an industrial point of view. The ability to operate is largely dependent on EPA's review in many cases. So it's that part of EPA that I think is probably less appreciated by the public, but is incredibly important.
Now let me ask you really a slightly more perhaps difficult question, and that is that, and Lee, I'm going to start with you on this one. Thinking back over your experience with the agency, what was the most disappointing policy experience of your tenure as administrator? And then I'm thinking particularly about, there are a lot of people who look to the administrator for leadership and look to you personally. And how did you manage both your own disappointment and their disappointment in that case?
You know, I was fortunate. I didn't have a lot of policy disappointments. I would say one, which turned out not to be a problem at all, was when we worked on reauthorization of the Clean Water Act. And we had worked on that with Congress, and we'd worked on it, frankly, we'd worked through the administration. And when it ultimately was passed by Congress, the president vetoed it. And it was obviously one of the things that I strongly disagreed with. And frankly, it wasn't that the president, in fact, said, I don't want to have the Clean Water Act. I don't want to sign the Clean Water Act. It had to do with the economics and the economic provisions of the Clean Water Act, the amount of money that was authorized. And OMB played a big role. At the time, the director of OMB recused himself from participating in the discussion because of a conflict that he had. At any rate, the president vetoed it over my recommendation and over the fact that I said, look, the veto is going to be overridden. There's no question it'll be overwhelmingly overridden. And so, one, I was disappointed, but two, it was quickly overridden. So the Clean Water Act was reauthorized and went into place. So I didn't have a great deal of disappointment. Didn't have to exhibit a great deal of disappointment. It was just one of those things that I thought was a waste of time and energy and political capital.
Yeah, I guess I was going to follow up by asking, how, when the president vetoed the act, how did you deal with the people who'd been working on this and trying to get it through, and what's their disappointment? But I guess if people thought that this veto was going to be overridden, then they didn't have much time to be disappointed.
That's right, and we all knew that it was going to be overridden. I mean, it was clearly the reauthorization was clearly bipartisan. It's interesting. I mean, Nixon did the exact same thing, and he vetoed the Clean Water Act, and it was overwhelmingly overridden as well. So we knew that there was very strong support in Congress for it. It made no sense to veto it. So there was not that, so I probably shouldn't use that as an example, but I don't have a bunch of examples. I didn't have a lot of policy issues that I was disappointed over because we got a lot of things done.
I think you led a charmed life myself.
Yeah, maybe so.
Gina, how about you?
I had a few actually that I could probably
I can think of a
about.
couple.
Yeah, but I don't know whether they were policy failures or, but I mean, other people can judge. You know, we at the towards the end of my term, the issues about PFOS and PFOA, all these forever chemicals showing up, it was very challenging for us. And it was when I realized that the only thing that I could add at my authority to do was to issue a health advisory. Now, really, you're finding all these forever chemicals in people's drinking water, and the best you can do is send out something that says, "Oh, excuse me, I don't think these are good for you." That was highly hard for me because it takes the process under the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, both are just long-term processes for what end up being very immediate needs. And we just simply did not have the right tool for the right time. And that to me was frustrating. We did the best we could to educate. We did the best we could to communicate with the governors over the need for testing and other things, but it's still an issue that is way too sort of not landed yet in terms of the surety you want to provide to people about what their rights and responsibilities are and what the risks are and how you minimize those risks. So that was a big issue for me. But there were others. That we could go on. But I mean, you do a lot and you're challenged a lot and you do the best you can.
Well, speaking of others, that's probably a good opportunity to turn to climate change. That over the last 30 years, U.S. policy concerning climate change became a polarizing issue in American politics. And why do you think that happened? And what's the most important thing we should do now to address the polarization around this issue?
Back to me, Stan.
Y'all have it. Y'all go however you want. Lee, if you'd like to go first, that's fine. But Gina can do too.
Sure. I think it happened for a variety of reasons. You know, it's interesting. It's been well over 30 years since I was at EPA, and we were talking about climate change when I was there and doing studies on climate change. And people, I think the polarization really won the complexity of the science and the difficulty of solutions. And over time, it became more and more an opportunity, I think, for people to debate the science and the complexity of that science, and kind of the issue of, well, what's natural versus what's man-made that's contributing to these changes. And I have been on panels with people who have debated both sides of that, eminent scholars who take different approaches. So I think that's one of the things that promoted the polarization. You saw some polarization as far as skeptics as well as supporters. And then frankly, I think it to some extent became politicized. And to some extent, I think it was overstated at times in terms of what the consequences were and when they were going to be felt. And it developed into a debate between various sides as opposed to let's move ahead and deal with this issue. And I think frankly, it got worse and worse over time.
And I'm showing my age here, but I remember a report you commissioned called Unfinished Business that identified climate change as one of the most significant issues that remained, that was there to face the agency. And that was in 1987, I think. So,
Yeah, Stan, and interestingly enough, I was criticized for some of the things that were in that report by special interest groups who didn't like the fact that their issue wasn't at the top of the list.
Well, Stan, can I just add that
yeah,
because
please.
Lee's probably a lot nicer than I am in many ways, so I'm a little bit more blunt. I don't think it was quite as much by accident. I think what we saw was originally, at least when climate started to come up in the conversation with any rigor, there was a lot of money expended by the fossil fuel companies on disinvestment. They followed the same kind of playbook as the tobacco companies did on cigarette smoking. And the danger of that is climate change. You know, you can't just take and reverse the problems that you see. Climate change is not reversible the same way you might get to clear your lungs as long as you didn't smoke very long. And so it was challenging. But I absolutely agree that one of the biggest problems was the communication piece. I think scientists were really leading the conversation, and they talked about it as a big planetary problem, and they raised so much concern and fear instead of trying to sort of work it through the way you do, the way you have to, is to personalize it, that it's not the planet, it's people. The planet doesn't care if there are people on it, we do. And it wasn't, and raising fear is usually not the best approach to motivating people to act. It makes people either deny it exists or to stand still. And when you want them to act, you really got to tell them. And thankfully now we have them, Lee, when in your days, you're right, the solutions weren't readily available, but we have great solutions now, which makes it a much easier problem, at least for people to get their head around and understand it's about their health, their well-being. Clean energy is good for them. It grows jobs, it cleans your air, it makes your life easier, and it's cheaper. Those are the solutions that we have. And the last issue is that really, I think that well, I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that. But I think that there are ways now that we have to not have to rely on science as much as our eyes and ears. You could see climate change happening. It's not a big stretch, and I think you can see that in when you talk to both Republicans and Democrats. Everybody acknowledges that there's a challenge. What we've not yet rallied around is how to address it in a way that's not going to leave significant portions of the labor community behind.
Well, let me follow up on that because the sort of the outward and visible signs of things you would do to address climate change often point toward the utility sector and the transportation sector. But the forestry and the agricultural sectors also have an important role to play in an overall climate strategy. And for either of you, what do you think would be, and Lee, you spent a long time in the forest products industry, so maybe I should go to you first. What do you think would be successful strategies for mobilizing these sectors to help reduce carbon emissions or carbon in the atmosphere?
Well, the forestry industry has looked at forest and reforestation as real opportunities as far as carbon sequestration is concerned. There's been debate about that. But in fact, there is a business model, and a number of companies follow that business model in the forestry arena in terms of carbon offsets in the context of sequestration and forestry. There is a growing understanding that there is a tremendous opportunity in agriculture generally. And I'm aware of opportunities and a lot of effort that's underway in terms of innovation in farming practices with carbon sequestration that I think have tremendous opportunity worldwide. There are some new sequestration trading opportunities that have developed in farming. I think that if you think about whether it's forestry or you think about farming and you think about economic incentives, there's an opportunity, there's a real opportunity for a significant amount of carbon sequestration over the long term in both of those sectors. And economics will drive it. Just like, frankly, I think economics is what's driving clean energy in the power sector. I mean, that in fact is just, you look now, we've got renewables that are cheaper than natural gas. I mean, gas is driving coal out, renewables are going to drive gas out, and it's all about economics. And the same is true over on the forestry and farming side.
So just to follow up quickly, and I want to turn to Gina on this, but does that mean you need to have some sort of a price on carbon to make all of that work?
Well, I've been an advocate for a carbon tax. I still think that approach like that, with a tax approach or a fee approach, however you want to characterize it, is something that can work. I do think, though, in terms of farming practices, if you think about an economic incentive, for instance, I know of one clearinghouse now that looks at $15 a ton for carbon sequestration in terms of farming practices. Well, that's a significant economic incentive for a farmer to change his farming practices to pick up that extra money. And that is basically as a result of being paid for industry that wants to reduce carbon with offsets as far as that farming is concerned. Those are the kind, I think you can have a trading program that in fact is all about economics. And that to a large extent is how the forestry sector handles it now, and I think is developing in terms of the farming sector.
Gina?
Well, Stan, I think that there are some ways, particularly we have to get agriculture involved in the climate discussion. There's no question about it. Farmers are getting really pummeled by the difficult both droughts and flooding and the fires that we're seeing. And I think that one of the things that is a pleasant rethink is that the Farm Bill now at least has experimented with giving farmers and paying them to have cover crops. Because part of this is about farming. How do you retain all of the nutrients in the soil, and how do you keep the carbon sequestered? And so there is a real opportunity here, I think, and one that's necessary, because as science is looking at the changing climate and how much carbon is now being gathered, if you will, in the atmosphere and trapped, we now know that we're unlikely to reduce carbon emissions sufficiently to preclude us from having to take some of that carbon back out of the atmosphere. So sequestration is going to be a big deal. And I think natural solutions really offer the most promise for that. I'm certainly much more interested in making sure that our farmers can produce our food than I am interested in how big a vacuum cleaner anyone can possibly make to suck that carbon out. So there is a real opportunity here, I think, for us to basically preserve the richness of the biodiversity that's left and use that as an incentive for a climate strategy that really emphasizes natural solutions, maintaining our forests and maintaining our farmland and keeping the richness in the soil.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I think engaging the agriculture community, farming, forestry, is exactly what needs to happen. And I think there's opportunity to do that worldwide. I also think you will, when we do things, we talk about cover crops, we talk about no-till, we talk about no-till, we talk about precision farming, where you reduce the amount of nitrogen used, a variety of things. You get all kinds of environmental benefits in addition to carbon sequestration. So there's big opportunity here on the farming side and on the environmental side.
And on the health side for farm workers.
Yeah.
You no longer need to use the kind of fossil fuel pesticides and fertilizers that you used to have to use.
That's
And
exactly
it preserves water. And it protects groundwater that's now being contaminated by the nitrates. And so there's so many ways in which I wish people wouldn't think of it so much as some big thing we have to do, as opposed to life isn't where it could be right now. These are real opportunities. My mom used to call them twofers and threefers when we went to the supermarket. You shop where it's a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1. So I don't want any strategy that just gets me greenhouse gas reductions. I want a strategy that gets me healthier food at my table. I want a strategy that saves me money on my electricity bills. I want a strategy that gives me clean air. Why can't we think about this in a more systemic way? That's the opportunity we have before us now, I think.
On that point, to move back into the political realm for a minute, Gina, how do you see the role of the executive branch and the role of the Congress in developing climate policies for the country over the next couple of years?
Oh, over the next couple of years, I don't think there's tremendous opportunity for legislative solutions. I just don't. I think with the Senate in the hands of Republicans, it tends not to want to take aggressive congressional measures. It doesn't mean there won't be any, but certainly not. I don't think that's where the sweeping change is going to come from. To me, a lot of the change we're seeing is built from the bottom up, as most of democracy does, which is I'm really cool about. I think it's great to see cities, 300 of them, pledging to meet the Paris Accord and doing a lot of work on climate. I'm happy to see like 29 states have clean energy standards and commitments to 100% clean energy. And I'm loving the Biden plan, which really looks at, clean energy by 2035 and net zero by 2050. These are all things that are doable, Stan. They can happen, and they are happening. And I think that President-elect Biden will use executive authority carefully, but he's also going to work really hard to bridge the gap between Republicans and Democrats on these issues. And I sure wish him well. If anyone can do it, I think it's Joe Biden.
We have a question here from the provost of the university, which says, both, thank you so much for being here. It says, both of you have described your EPA leadership as managerial in significant part. And could you discuss the importance of well-trained, seasoned managers in government? Said the U.S. gives much more credence to corporate management while deriding bureaucrats as hapless at best or corrupt at worst.
Maybe I should have you address this, Dan. You've been one of those hapless and corrupt people for a really long time. I don't know, Lee, do you want, all I would say is that, I don't think people realize that this deep state they're worried about is just some of the most professional, expert, focused, dedicated, passionate individuals that anyone has ever had the pleasure to work with. I cannot tell you, no matter where I go, the public sector just attracts some tremendous people like you, Stan, who learn your job and do it well. And they're not people that are activists looking for everything that they personally want. They're just doing their jobs. And I think it's a terrific honor and pleasure to work with government employees for as long as I have. They are the best of the best, and they get pretty good management training.
Lee?
Well, I would agree with that in terms of my experience, 20 years in government. The experience I had at EPA was a terrific experience. Dedicated employees, very professional, very committed to the agency, passionate about their jobs. I really enjoyed working there. I will back up for a minute, though, and say that having been in business and in a number of companies and see the amount of time that we spend on succession management, ensuring that people are well prepared as they move up through an organization, and particularly when they get to the senior levels of a company, whether it is heading a major division, whether it is becoming the president of a company or the CEO of a company. A tremendous amount of time is spent in making sure that you have well-trained people as they move into those jobs, and a lot of accountability around it. I don't see the same thing as far as government is concerned. I'm not talking about the career employees at all. I'm talking about the way in which people like me, for instance, was selected to go into an agency. Now, I was a government employee, but I felt like, and I don't know how Gina felt, it might have been totally different under the Obama administration, but I had an understanding when I became administrator that the White House was not going to put people in the agency that I didn't want, and I wasn't going to put people in the agency that they didn't want. We were going to come to agreement. But the fact that you don't have the kind of structured approach to select your senior managers of government agencies, and I'm talking about, what did I just see where President-elect Biden has got 4,000 appointments he's going to make? Well, making sure that those are the right people in the right places is something that I think is critical for the well-functioning of our government in this country. And I'm not comfortable with the fact that we've got a process in place to make that happen.
Gina, do you have any other further comments on that?
I don't think so, but you know, I had the luxury of being the second term administrator, and so for me, I had people there that I could trust and had been tested. But I get your point, and I think it's a valid one. But it is the way that governments work.
It is. I agree. And I, like you though, Gina, I was very fortunate in that Bill Ruckelshaus basically was there for 18 months with a mandate to get the agency on track. So he brought in an incredibly talented group of senior leaders, very professional, very capable, that I then inherited. So I was very, very fortunate. But I do, when I've seen how we work and spend the time we spend on managers in business, and I think back on some of the ways I saw people appointed in positions in government, I think there is something lacking.
Well, I will take a point of personal privilege on this for 2 points. One is to relate the story that I was told with substantial reliability about the conversation that Bill Ruckelshaus had with President Reagan when President Reagan asked him to come back. And Bill had enough sense about this to say that he needed to have an independent hand in appointing his own people. And he went in and told the president that that was one of the conditions of him taking the job. And so he said that this was a little unusual. He said, "Mr. President, I need to be able to have my own people there." And the president looked at him and said, "Well, obviously we haven't been doing such a good job." The other thing, and Gina, you will appreciate this, Lee, one of the things you did in your tenure was to start up SES candidate development programs. The first ones occurred under your leadership. And Gina will remember that when she asked me if I would come up, that what she said, what would you like to do? I said, I would like to start up an SES candidate development program. And so we in fact did 2 in the 2 years I was there, and I'm very proud of that. But that's building on the legacy that you had left. So
it was Jim Barnes and myself. My deputy Jim Barnes was passionate about that, and I'm very proud of the fact that we spent the time and the effort on the SES development program that we did. I thought it was critical.
Yes, but deputies can do stuff only if they have good, solid support from administrators. I can speak to that.
Now I know where it came from, Lee. I'm really impressed because that's why I had such great people. I mean, it's amazing.
Well, let's see. I have a couple of let's see. So we have several questions here. Let me see if I can. Here's one from a professor here at Wake Forest. And the question is, what authority does EPA have over sustainability issues? And does the agency need updated legislative authority to address modern cross-media environmental pollution?
Well, that's a good question. The cross-media issue is a good question. I'm hesitant to suggest that Congress needs to try to develop new legislation that would somehow bridge the various authorities that the agency's been given. I think the agency does have the ability to look across media itself and can establish the administrative and management processes to do that. And I think that is an appropriate approach for them to take. I think it would be very difficult for Congress to try to do something in a broad sense that would drive that, as opposed to the agency doing something that drives that.
And the only thing that I would add to that is I don't know whether we need to. I won't repeat it. I don't disagree with it. I think the only thing that we do have, though, is that the federal government is a purchaser, and it's a business in and of itself. So one of the things that I think many CEOs focus on, and what the federal government needs to focus on, and state governments, is to be sustainable themselves, because the power of the federal budget could be used to basically send big private sector market signals about what they value and how they, and so if they start driving around in cleaner cars, it sends a market signal. It helps to drive the market. If they take care of their own buildings and make them energy efficient and they purchase renewables, it's a big deal. So the power of the federal budget is substantial. And what we spend money on to enhance innovation and technology is a big deal. So in many ways, we do what some of the best companies do. They challenge themselves to be sustainable, and through that, they help to develop the markets and the mechanisms to get it done.
Okay, we have a question here, Gina, for you about considering your experience leading both EPA and the NRDC. Mm-hmm. Which organization has given you more of an opportunity in your mind to have an impact on individuals?
Oh, that's a good question. Since I've only been at NRDC since January, I guess it's hands down EPA, which I spent 8 years there. But I get the question isn't sort of counting. They both play very different but really important roles. One of the I'm very happy right now that I've tried the nonprofit advocacy world, because I think it has a place. For example, we've been litigating rollbacks of this administration of some of the fundamental environmental protections that we've been taking for granted, that they've been rolling back, and we're, winning over 90% of the cases. That matters. It's a good thing. It allows another administration to rebuild more effectively. And I think that advocacy matters. I mean, you need to have a voice for people that don't always think as the government wants us to think, and that every administration has its blind spots and its weaknesses and the things it wants to do and the things it hasn't thought about. And that's what advocacy is all about. So I think they're both different, but they can be very mutually reinforcing, even if they're not mutually agreeable. In the end, it really is finding the right path forward for the American people, and hopefully both consider that their jobs.
Lee, do you have any thoughts on that, on the relationship between government and advocacy organizations?
I totally think that advocacy organizations have a role to play, an important role to play, and particularly I saw it at a federal policy level. Gina's organization played an incredibly important role as far as legislation is concerned, and as far as regulation is concerned. Some of the people who work for her now gave me hell when I was administrator, as far as, but also were entirely supportive on a number of other things. I think about the stratospheric ozone issue, and I think about the role that a number of the advocacy groups played. And frankly, it was both the environmental side and the industry trade groups that played a role there, that ended up being supportive on both sides, that helped us get that done. So I think they all have a role to play. I will say, though, that it all centers around, for instance, in the environmental area at a federal level, it all centers around EPA. EPA is kind of the heart. And so the approach that EPA takes, the emphasis on science, the emphasis on regulation, enforcement, implementing those laws is critical. I mean, the advocacy groups on all sides can push and shove, but if the agency with all of its authority decides that it's just going to absolutely head down the wrong path, I mean, we've seen it can do that. And we just absolutely have a hard time with it. So having an agency and having a strong agency is critical to environmental protection in this country, and frankly, in terms of leadership in the world.
We actually have a series of questions that are kind of speaking to a couple of angles on this. So let me just go through a couple of these, and I'll paraphrase the question, but that it's the last 4 years, according to the questioner, have been pretty tough years for EPA, and there's significant loss of talent and some demoralization. And given the loss of talented staff at EPA, if you had the job now, how would you look to bring back excellence to the agency?
Well, I mean, from my point of view, it's all about team building. Whether it's EPA or another organization, you're going to have to rebuild EPA at this point. We were largely at that point when I came to EPA. Bill Ruckelshaus came back. It was all about rebuilding that agency, bringing in a new team of people, a strong group of professionals, establishing a really good, solid science advisory board, and a clean air science advisory board, all of the things that you need. And it's not done overnight. But it is absolutely critical for the agency to be rebuilt with the kind of talent that's needed. And it's just like building any organization. It's going out and finding that talent and bringing that talent into the agency. It's also, given the talent that exists in the agency, as Gina said earlier, the opportunity to participate actively, to be a part of an overall team. I mean, I'll guarantee you, you've lost talent, but I'll guarantee you there's tremendous talent still inside that agency that, in fact, you need to draw on.
What he said.
Then let me go with a slightly different question, and that is that both of you saw the role that EPA served in international cooperation with environmental agencies abroad. And the questioner cites the example, Lee, of your USA-USSR bilateral agreement, and Gina, your case, the things like the Kigali agreement. What do you think? What does your experience suggest needs to happen now?
Oh, we need to get back in the international arena right away. I think over the past 4 years, the U.S. has lost a significant amount of its credibility because we have pulled out of long-held international agreements. And so I know that we'll be heading back into the Paris Agreement pretty quickly. I think that's going to pay a big dividend for us in terms of being able to once again collaborate with our allies effectively and do it in a way that brings the world together. So that's terrific. We also have to start the smaller track 1 and track 2 conversations, which really have continued to have good collaboration between us and where climate is concerned, China and India, and make sure that we continue to explore opportunities. So we just have to jump right back in and recognize that what I've seen and what I understand myself is that people will welcome us back with open arms. And we should take that opportunity and run with it, but also recognize that we can no longer jump back at those tables and start bossing people around. We're going to have to rebuild those relationships and understand what has been going on and how the rest of the world sees it, because we are not always providing the leadership we need if we're not listening before we speak.
And Lee, you told a great story earlier in the earlier session about the importance of relationships in connection with the Montreal Protocol. That might be of some interest to the larger audience as well.
Well, I really agree with what Gina just got through saying about jumping back in. I mean, whether it's bilateral agreements where we're working directly with other countries on issues of mutual concern, or multilateral. When I was there, we actually had a number of projects and good, solid relationships with the Soviet Union. It was the only agreement that had survived during the Cold War, was this environmental agreement. And we would interact with each other on these 30 to 40 projects. We got to know each other. We worked with each other. We had the same kind of working relationship with China. We had a great working relationship with the Netherlands. We did a lot of work through OECD with all the European countries. We had a great relationship with Canada. All of those things came to play when we all began working on, through the United Nations Environment Program, the negotiations around ozone depletion. And those bilateral relationships and the credibility that EPA had in working with those other countries had a major role to play in our ability, and we did have a lot to do with bringing a number of those countries to the table. And our scientists, educating their scientists, and administrators to administrators working together, we were able to come together with a negotiation that ultimately, with a lot of pushing and shoving, we were able to conclude in Montreal in a way that I don't think would have ever happened if we hadn't had those kind of relationships to build on. And it was a 3-year process. It was a 3-year process to get that treaty concluded, but it was those relationships that were the foundation that really established that. The United Nations Environment Program, for instance, Mustafa Tolba, who was the head of that, played a major role. And it was our working with him to do an overall global risk assessment that served as the scientific basis for what we were doing as far as that overall negotiation is concerned. It's a great example, I think, of how you can work collaboratively. And frankly, given the kind of issues we face globally these days, whether it's climate change or ocean issues or whatever, we've got to have those kind of relationships to build global agreements.
And Stan, I know that you know this, but your listeners should know that the Montreal Protocol is far and away considered by everybody who knows these things as the strongest international agreement that's ever been written and implemented. It was an incredible feat, Lee, and it's something that you should be really proud of. I know I built on it with the Kigali Amendment. That was an amendment to the Montreal Protocol because it had all the pieces that you would need. It had the technical pieces, the funding support that you'd need, the good strategy about working together on a consensus approach to get to the right goals using with everybody involved. It was an amazing piece of work, and thank God for it, because really it was able to put us on a path to resolve what was fundamentally just as big an issue as climate change. And now we're using the same tool to address climate change. It's pretty remarkable.
But it's also an example, back to your earlier point about climate change and whether the executive or the congressional branches take a leadership. And I really think, not from a partisan point of view, but from a management point of view and a policy point of view, the executive branch has got to take the leadership role. Yeah. They've got to take the leadership role as far as science is concerned, as far as the global environment is concerned, as far as the ability to work across countries. They've got to take a role. Now, clearly, there's got to be communication with Congress, and ultimately, there's got to be interaction with Congress I would love to see climate dealt with in the context of a treaty. And I think you could take the Paris Accord and you could build on it to work towards a treaty. So ultimately, you'd want to go to Congress with that treaty, just like we did with the Montreal Protocol. With the Montreal Protocol, it was a treaty and we had it was approved unanimously by Congress.
Amazing.
We have a question here about should the EPA administrator be a cabinet level position, or would that tend to make the position more political and less effective as a result? I have to say that from my own perspective, how the position could be any more political than it already is hard to imagine, but let me just ask the question. I think this is really a question about elevation of EPA to a cabinet department.
That does seem to always get asked. Lee, you must have been asked that same question.
There were advocates of that when I was there.
Yeah, I see absolutely nothing wrong with being slightly different. At least in the administration I worked in, you're at the same table. I even have at home my own little cabinet chair because I was sitting with everybody else. So I get why people ask that question, but I think in reality, you stand with the other secretaries, and I was never treated differently, except when I was being a pain in the neck, and I probably deserved it. So I don't see it as being a significant issue. I never felt diminished by it.
I really agree with that. I didn't see it as any issue. I mean, you participate in the cabinet sessions, you participate in, quite frankly, from my point of view, I'd like to see the agency leadership be less political rather than more political. I'd almost like to see EPA as a more defined independent agency. And I mean, as Bill Ruckelshaus told me, he said, look, Lee, it's really not Republican or Democrat that's all about. It's protecting the environment. And as a result, I didn't participate in the political process.
Me either.
I just didn't think that was appropriate because I was running a big regulatory agency. And I just felt like it was not appropriate for the kind of agency that I was responsible for to make it political. Partisan political is what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions which we'll sort of try to use to move towards our conclusion. One of which is, let me say for the record, I am not asking anybody to engage in speculation about appointments because I think that's a complete waste of time. But I do want to ask about what characteristics you think the new administration should consider in looking for new political leadership of EPA. And we've talked some about that, but you both have unique perspectives in having sort of been in that position. What are the things that you think characteristics a new administration should look for?
Who goes next? Let me jump in. When people ask me that, I usually say I think we need to have an Anthony Fauci as the next EPA administrator. Just and I don't mean that they need to be a scientist. But we need the Anthony Fauci of the EPA. I need somebody who's trusted again. The big problem that EPA faces now, that's it, is that people don't feel like they're listening and paying attention to the mission of the agency and working at the behest of people. I mean, you take an oath to that mission and to work as best you can under the law. And we need to build trust, not internally and externally. So we need to have somebody who pays attention to science, pays attention to the law, works for the American people, and is faithful to that mission. Those are the qualities that I am looking for. And to me, that's sort of the Anthony Fauci of the EPA.
I think that's a great way to put it. History tells us, in my opinion, the kind of person we need. Because I think the agency, to some extent, is in the same position it was back in the early days of the Reagan administration. And President Reagan said, we need to change this. And he brought in Bill Ruckelshaus. And that's exactly what we needed. A man who had total integrity, was a true leader, a great communicator, had total confidence of the president as well as the public because of his prior experience in government, and put together a great team of people. He was a great listener. He was a great communicator. So when I think about the kind of characteristics of Bill Ruckelshaus, that's exactly the characteristics I'd say we need to think about when we think about who ought to go in as the next administrator of EPA.
Changing direction for just a bit, there's a question that's come in about this summer. We've seen an increase in national attention on race due to its connection to the unequal COVID infection rates among different segments of the U.S. population. And what role do you see EPA playing moving forward with regards to environmental justice?
Well, I mean, it's clearly a major issue. I mean, and it has been for a long time. And I think it's been recognized more and more over time, particularly over the last, I'd say, 20 years than it was, say, when I was there. But I think it's fairly well documented why, in fact, environmental impacts have been more severe in certain communities than other communities. And it basically is what the environmental justice movement is all about as far as the environment is concerned. And it needs to be a factor when we think about the kind of approaches we take, the kind of places, the kind of priorities, the kind of input as well as output that we provide.
And let me just build on that a little bit, because Lee's right. I think we were all surprised, people who have been doing our work, that anyone thought it was a front page headline, like a big surprise that people in the Black community were dying at twice the rates from exposure to COVID-19 as their white counterparts. We would know that. I would guess that, because pollution has always hit the Black and brown, indigenous, and the low income communities the hardest. They're frontline and fence line communities, and they are also communities that don't have good housing, don't often have access to clean water and wastewater facilities. They all too often don't have access to healthy food. They don't have green spaces to get out and run around in. And they're living in cities that are heavily polluted or more polluted than others. So they come from a position where they are really experiencing an oversized impacts from pollution. And they're the same communities that are on the front line on climate change. And so when you look at it, EPA has been the main advocate for and manager of the Clinton administration executive order on environmental justice. And so we've had a strong program. We tried to always be faithful in bringing the interagency community together to look at this issue, but there's so much more to be done. And the one thing that climate change might present is an opportunity to look more systemically at these issues and to actually factor in systemic racism as a condition that can be reconciled and dealt with much more aggressively, and has to be in climate solutions moving forward.
I have two closing questions, and the first of them, and Lee, I'm going to turn to you first on this. What advice do you have for the EPA career staff and new political leadership based on the lessons you learned from your time as the administrator?
Well, I've already said a few things about
Right.
the appointees that will go into EPA, and the kind of people I'm expecting are going to be people that are capable. I would say really build a strong team, a strong management team, build an opportunity for the career staff to play a important and vital role in decision making. Rebuild the science effort in EPA and the input that both internal and external scientists have in terms of the overall priority setting and decision making in the agency. I'd say as far as the career staff is concerned, it is really prepared to participate actively inside the agency, prepare to regain your footing as far as that participation is concerned. The agency that you're a part of is a critical part of what this country needs to be about, and that's protecting our environment. And you, the career staff, are at the heart of whether that's going to get done well or not. So be prepared and be active.
And very quickly, just the only other two things I'd add was, number one, I'll tell them the same advice I told them when I was leaving, which was to keep your butts in the seats. Don't leave. Remember, it is an agency that's worth sticking around, and work with the transition team. You know, if you can, and that's allowable over the next couple of months, get to know the people that are coming in, give them all the information you can, as we always do, one administration to another. Don't hold back what's challenging, what isn't, and have faith that EPA will bounce back. It will take time, but it's a great agency and they're great staff. And I have tremendous faith that if they stick around and they keep doing their jobs, that our lives will be better for it, and theirs will as well.
And then the last question, what advice would you give to young people about a career in public service at a time when some of the spin around this is that somehow government can't get the big things done?
Well, let me just say that what I always say is that, you know, public service will never make you rich, but it is the richest opportunity of a lifetime, and grab it. It is exactly where you want to be. You don't need to stay there forever, but it's going to be a wonderful education and opportunity and learning experience. And you'll leave there feeling like you did something important with your life. And to me, that's what it's all about.
Well, you know, I had 20 years in government and I've had 30 years in business, both of which have been rewarding in many different ways, both of which have been challenging. I still look back on my time in government as just tremendously rewarding. And my time at EPA was just the ultimate. And Gina said I should be proud of some of the things I did with the Montreal Protocol. I am proud, and I'm proud of the team of people that worked on that for so hard for so long. Those are the kind of things you look back on and you realize you really did make a difference. And you had a team of people that worked to make a difference in this country for the kind of things that are so important. So my advice to young people are, if you see an opportunity in public service, take it. There's all kinds of opportunities out there. And let me tell you, government can and does get the big things done. I mean, you just look at all the things that we've done and are doing. So yeah, I think a career in public service is great. As Gina said, you don't have to stay there your whole life, but it'll be a rewarding opportunity.
Well, I didn't quite stay there my whole life, but I stayed there a long time, and I can only echo those wonderful sentiments that both of you said, except Lee, I'm trying to figure out how you spent 20 years in government and 30 years in the private sector when you look like you're only 50 years old. So
don't I wish?
Well, I cannot believe that we've already reached the end of our time together. And if there were any way for us to give you a virtual round of applause, it would just be overwhelming. But since they can't do that, let me express on behalf of everyone who participated tonight that, and also to thank you both for your support of the efforts of the Environmental Protection Network, which, for those who don't know what that is, it's a nonpartisan group of about 500 former EPA employees whose work spanned many administrations, including the administrations of our guests here tonight, and has been thinking about a lot of the same issues we discussed tonight. And your endorsement of that work, and along with 4 other EPA administrators, really meant a lot to a lot of people. So I can't thank you enough for that also. And with that, thanks to everyone for joining us, and thank you both so much for being here with us tonight, and for everyone who was with us to share in this extraordinary evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Stan. Thanks, Lee.
Thank you, Gina.